All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to today's sub-theme 5 session on monitoring the forests to restore ecosystems, where we'll explore the vision and the progress of the Task Force on Monitoring in support to the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. My name is Khalil Walji. I'm a scientist and coordinator of the Landscapes for Our Future program with C4ECRAF, and that basically means that I work at the intersection of research for development, climate, and landscape management. Now, I've enjoyed my first few days here at the World Forestry Congress, and I think what's been clear to me, and perhaps clear to many of you who work in this space, is just how difficult this work can be and how integrated the challenges are that we face. And I think especially for the young professionals like myself, the systems and the institutions which we sometimes aim to move can feel stubborn and can feel hard to invigorate with as much action that's necessary to really combat these urgent challenges that are at our doorsteps. So yes, the work is difficult, but we do it because we care about our futures, we care about our communities. And I think there is a picture of that future that we'd like right at our fingertips. Now, just this week, at this very Congress, FAO released the latest State of the World's Forest 2022. The SOFO set out 3 key actions that are needed to promote a more sustainable world, more sustainable land use, and help tackle the climate crisis. The first one was halting deforestation and maintaining forests, which have the potential to avoid around 3.6 gigatons of CO2 per year. And the second, which is relevant to this session, is restoring degraded lands and expanding agroforestry, which also had the potential for 1.5 gigatons of CO2 per year. Now, these are immense opportunities, and I think the value proposition of today's session is centered around an age-old adage, which is you can't manage what you can't measure. So monitoring and evaluation will be critical in our understanding of progress towards these key actions, as well as how we are achieving and how we are learning as we progress with our ambition to restore over 1 billion hectares of land that's been committed through the various global processes. Now, this was further emphasized on Monday in the plenary on the UN Decade, where FAO's Goodwill Ambassador for the Near East and North Africa, Her Royal Highness, Ms. Princess Basma bin Ali, emphasized that monitoring and assessment is one of the 4 critical pillars to the health of the planet in this remaining 8 years of action. And I think there's been a lot of words said thus far in the Congress, and there will be many more. But clearly these dialogues are not enough, and we need to move towards action. So in the ethos of action, we've organized today's session to display and show the many actions and the many innovations that the members of the Task Force on Monitoring have taken, and the efforts that they've taken to streamline, innovate, and create tools and technologies so that we can truly understand the progress we're making towards the UN Decade. These colleagues are working to ensure the global movement is truly a science and evidence-based restoration movement so that we can track our actions and scale investments which are so desperately needed. So to get us started with today's session, I'd like to turn the floor or the virtual microphone over to Julian Fox, who's the Senior Forestry Officer and Team Leader of FAO's National Forest Monitoring Team. Julian's going to provide us with a keynote presentation to launch the Framework for Ecosystem Restoration Monitoring, the firm. Julian, we regret you couldn't join us in person, but thrilled you can still make it this morning. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Khalil. Yeah, I mean, in my keynote, I was actually planning to bring forward that statement that you've already made really nicely, Khalil, and that is restoration as one of the solution pathways for the multiple crises, I think, that face humanity at the moment. I mean, we see commitments of an area to restore an area the size of China, 1 billion hectares. But we see very few assessments of this progress, and that I think is a bit worrying to the international community. How do we monitor restoration achievements in a transparent way? I mean, assessing progress is difficult. In many cases, there's insufficient restoration-related data. Information and indicators are lacking that would allow transparent monitoring of restoration and support implementation at scale. For marine and aquatic environments, there is very limited monitoring data, information, and indicators. In this context, the Monitoring Task Force was created by the UN Decade Management to collaboratively overcome these difficulties in assessing progress. The task force was created 2 years ago as a voluntary partnership, and we have seen real willingness to collaborate with a shared vision for collective action on restoration, which has been really, really wonderful. The framework for ecosystem restoration monitoring that we are launching today realizes this vision and is the outcome of this partnership and leverages the work of many organizations, some of the key players you see on the panel today. I mean, to allow us to transparently monitor the progress of global restoration, we need some technical solutions. And without further ado, let me move into the launch presentation for several elements of what we call the FIRM. Global indicators to track progress using existing official country data and the launch of the FIRM registry and the updated geospatial platform. So ecosystems, as we know, support all life on Earth. I mean, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration is a rallying call for the protection and revival of ecosystems all around the world for the benefit of people and nature. It aims to halt the degradation of ecosystems and restore them to achieve global goals, but more importantly, I think tackle the planetary emergency that we face. Only with healthy ecosystems can we enhance people's livelihoods, counteract climate change, and stop the collapse of biodiversity. The UN Decade runs from 2021 through 2030, which is also the decade for action on the Sustainable Development Goals, and the timeline scientists have identified as the last chance to prevent catastrophic climate change. The Task Force on Monitoring was established to develop an operational monitoring framework for the decade to track progress as we attempt to restore degraded ecosystems on an unprecedented scale. A framework that identifies biophysical and socioeconomic indicators that can be used to measure restoration progress for all ecosystems. As described in the official text of the Declaration of the UN Decade, we should build on indicators and data from the SDG process and existing multilateral frameworks, so as not to place additional reporting burden on countries. The development of the monitoring framework for the decade has required extensive collaboration and partnership, and we drew and continue to draw expertise and contributions from all relevant experts. The task force was established 2 years ago as a voluntary partnership, and we've seen a real willingness to collaborate with a shared vision for collective action on restoration, which has been wonderful. We currently have 315 experts from 115 organizations in the task force. We are divided into 3 sub-task forces, one focused on the monitoring of terrestrial ecosystems, forests, pasture, croplands, another focused on the monitoring of aquatic and transitional ecosystems, marine, inland waters, peatlands, mangroves, and finally, a specific effort focused on socioeconomic elements, which are critical to restoration. The overall effort is coordinated by FAO with the support of many, many organizations. I mean, as stated at the bottom there, the vision of the task force is that a science-based restoration movement should be informed by the best available technology and information for planning and monitoring restoration actions on the ground, and that the latest innovation should be broadly accessible to restoration stakeholders. This can help turn commitments into actions and can help scale investments in restorations. Today's panel includes some of our most active and engaged members, and we really appreciate everyone's support, their willingness to collaborate, remove duplication of effort, and move forward together. A summary note on the progress and plans for the task force can be found in a link that we'll share in the chat. If you would like to engage, please do let us know. All contributions to the task force and #GenerationRestoration are extremely welcome. We have made progress that we presented today, but there is still much work to do. Next slide, please. I'm pleased to launch one major work stream from the Task Force on Monitoring today, the launch of a publication that identifies global indicators for monitoring restoration progress. Next slide. As described in the decision text, an operational monitoring framework for the decade should build on indicators and data from SDG processes and multilateral frameworks. In that way, support those critical processes that the UN system and the whole world has gathered around. To do this, we launched two processes 2 years ago, one consultative and one analytical. You see before you the publication, and we'll put the link to that in the chat, and I invite you all to look at it. But maybe move to the next slide, please. Wonderful. The two processes were, one was analytical and one was consultative. The analytical process compiled a database with more than 60 frameworks with 4,000 indicators and used machine learning to select relevant indicators related to restoration. The consultative process involved consultation with monitoring task force members and the custodian agencies. The socioeconomic subtask force, the terrestrial subtask force, the aquatic and transitional subtask force. More than 200 experts lent in and helped us identify indicators that they thought were related to their particular ecosystem or their particular outcome, whether socioeconomic or biophysical. We also engaged with the key custodian agencies such as UNEP, Ramsar, UNCCD, UNFCCC, and the IUCN. We converged on 20 headline indicators for monitoring global progress over the decade. By combining the two processes and by applying a selection criteria based on alignment to restoration, geographic coverage, and whether there was already data for the indicator to help create a baseline, and also how many data points would be collected through the decade through official data collection streams. The 20 headline indicators are described in the publication and are also available on the FIRM platform, where you can view existing data for each indicator. All ecosystems are represented, both biophysical and socioeconomic indicators are represented, and the headline indicators include the 8 SDGs as shown here. The approach to indicator selection was inclusive and transparent, and I invite you to examine the indicators and the methodology in the publication launched today and on the FIRM platform. They will be used to provide annual reports of the progress of the decade based on officially reported country data. Next slide, please. I'm also delighted to announce a major update of our geospatial platform, which is built on FAO's corporate hand-in-hand geospatial infrastructure. This ensures we have a sustainable platform throughout the decade. A demo will start playing, showing some of the new updated features and the simplified structure that we've developed for the platform. It includes the data for the headline indicators that you see shown here, where you can see existing baseline data for each of these. I think the one that is coming up now is for SDG 15.1.1, a forest area, which is particularly relevant for this World Congress. And you can also add your own biophysical and socioeconomic data. There we go. You see the forest area data for 2020 coming up in the platform there in the demonstration. Most importantly, the update also leverages partnerships and interoperability and provides links and tools to many other useful platforms for monitoring restoration, tools for creating your own data and existing frameworks, such as FAO CEPOL platform, GROW's Restoration Project Information Sharing Framework, which we're super happy to have presented immediately after this, as well as links to restoration monitoring platforms such as Restore and IUCN's Restoration Barometer, which are also represented on today's panel. This is a platform we will use to measure the progress of the UN decade, and we'll be continually working on it. So please do send us your feedback if you see areas for improvement. It's just showing some other features. We also include a section on best practices, and we include the NICFI high resolution data, gratefully provided through the NICFI KSAT Planet data. Next slide, please. Now, the final launch for today is the FIRM registry, a critical piece of what we set out to create 2 years ago. The FIRM registry provides an interactive form for recording geospatial information and project metadata for restoration projects using a consistent approach. It was designed to allow information sharing between platforms using a consistent framework, such as Restore and the Restoration Barometer and others. We intend to remove duplication of effort as much as possible. We don't have time to duplicate effort at this particular moment. Hence, we intend to be interoperable with other platforms, ensuring that people do not need to enter their information in more than one platform. Some of the technical information, we are aligned with the IATI standard. All the geographic data is aligned to the ISO standards, and the restoration activities we include are aligned to those identified by the Best Practice Task Force of the UN Decade and WOCAT. Indicators are aligned to the UN Decade headline indicators and will allow you to track and report the progress of your own restoration intervention. The registry will be deployed to FAO projects, which include restoration, and there are many, as well as other restoration initiatives, UN restoration projects, and with a specific focus on the UN Decade flagships, which we'll be hearing a lot more about in the coming months. The registry will also allow for data aggregation for global level reporting of restoration progress. Today, we launched the first version of the firm registry, and we invite you all to register your restoration project so you can be part of #GenerationRestoration. And again, if you see areas for improvement, please do send feedback. It would be greatly appreciated. Next slide, please. Very briefly, the link, we have the firm registry and we have the firm platform. The firm registry is for storing geospatial information and data on restoration projects using a consistent and interoperable framework. And it is designed to be shown then on the firm platform if the person that created the data so wishes to. You can then visualize and disseminate your project data through the firm platform. The firm platform, as I described, is for accessible and transparent information and tracking of progress, and will be the main tool we will use to show progress through the decade. And also provide links to many tools for custom analysis, such as FAO's CEPOL platform. Next slide, please. That was a bit of a whirlwind tour of some of the products we have launched today, which is extremely exciting. And I think in 2 years as a restoration monitoring community, we have come a really long way. The global indicators, the firm platform, some of the other platforms you hear about today that are super exciting, and the firm registry that we launched today. I think they all represent a real leap forward in our ability to support transparent monitoring of the progress of the UN Decade, which is so urgently needed. But we still have work to do. So moving forward, we will deploy the firm for monitoring UN Decade flagships, FAO projects, and country-level interventions. We'll continue to strengthen those critical linkages between our platforms, the UN Decade Hub, Restore, WRI's platforms, IUCN's Barometer, ensuring interoperability and continuing to strive toward avoiding any duplication of effort. We'll integrate additional operational tools and platforms from partners, building on a large mapping exercise of tools for monitoring restoration that was commenced last year, and will be the ingredients for an important report coming out later this year from the Global Restoration Initiative, Global Restoration Observatory and WRI. And we hope to engage more partners and users in its development. We will also develop a firm dashboard to communicate global restoration monitoring progress to a general audience and generate annual reporting templates. Next slide, please. Finally, thank you for your interest and your partnership in building a transparent, science-based restoration movement. I really look forward to engaging a panel. Thank you very much. Back to you, Khalil.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Julian, for this comprehensive but very important update on the firm, and truly exciting to hear all the progress that's been made by the task force, the geospatial platform, the launch of the project registry, and the 20 headline indicators as well. I think you said 200 experts over 2 years through a consultative process. So quite a time-intensive undertaking, but a huge congratulations to the task force for the launch. Julian, I wanted to just quickly follow up on your presentation. Can you share a little bit how the reporting will then be actioned through the firm? I presume it's going to be through self-reporting, and if so, can you just share a bit on the importance of self-reporting of that data through the firm?
Yes, for sure. So, I mean, basically the official reporting of the decade, we hope to create an annual report, and we hope to create a really important report halfway through the decade for the Secretary General to present the progress of the decade. We will use official country data. We'll support the SDG process. So that's what the 20 headline indicators represent. Yeah. They represent a cross-section of the hundreds and hundreds of official data streams that are coming from countries, and will allow us to create a report of progress. So this is the official country data, which we need to respect. Yeah. Parallel to that, I think there is scope to collect our own data also through the different restoration platforms that you'll see presented today, through the firm registry, and in that way try to track progress, I would say, of restoration for the non-state actors. And this is where I see we see a lot of movement in the restoration space. We see a lot of grassroots action. We see a lot of local level restoration, which is extremely excited and would not necessarily be captured in the national level reporting. So that's something we hope to do through the firm registry, through the collaboration with partners here, and also add some color to the official data and the 20 headline indicators with some non-state actor data, I think, to show that sort of more grassroots level restoration action, and make sure that's not missed in the reporting.
Fantastic. Thanks, Julian. Yeah, so I guess the firm is sort of playing that umbrella role in accommodating for both the country level reporting, but then through the, as you mentioned, the firm registry, and also through the interoperability of the other members within the task force, there's the opportunity to bring all of that data into one sort of reporting mechanism. Thanks very much, Julian. I think it provides a nice segue to our second speaker. So I'd like to invite Gillian Gladstone from Climate Focus and from the Global Restoration Observatory. And Gillian's going to share an update on project level restoration monitoring for the UN decade. Gillian, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Khalil. So nice to be speaking with you all today. As Khalil said, my name is Gillian Gladstone. I work for an organization called Climate Focus, and I coordinate the multi-stakeholder network, the Global Restoration Observatory, or GROW. I'm very happy to be introducing today a restoration project information sharing framework that the GROW network developed through a consultative process over the past year. Next slide. So just briefly, the Global Restoration Observatory, or GROW, is a multi-stakeholder network of universities, international organizations, research institutes, and practitioners from various cross-sections of the natural resource management community, including remote sensing experts, data analysts, policymakers, and practitioners. The GROW was created in 2019 after a series of discussions focused on the need for improved data on global restoration progress and alignment and integration of existing data and systems. Climate Focus coordinates and convenes the network to support improved capacity for restoration monitoring. Next slide. The initial goal of developing this framework was to identify potential common or shared monitoring indicators that could be adopted by various restoration monitoring efforts to simplify data needs, to reduce duplicative requests for information of practitioners and project managers, and to allow for more effective progress tracking by enabling sort of apples to apples comparison between projects. If you think this sounds familiar, that's because it's a very complementary effort to the firm registry, as Julian just said. The project level information sharing framework that I'm talking about is intended to provide external support for and validation of the UN Decade monitoring efforts. It aims to support systematic and aligned data collection at the project level, complementing the firm's indicator guidance, which focuses more on the global and country level. Next slide. So the framework was developed through a consultative process led by our partners at the Society for Ecological Restoration. We began mapping existing indicators from over 50 databases, frameworks, standards, and tools. Then SCR convened participants, many of whom are participating in this panel today, through multiple workshops, rounds of revisions, and practitioner-focused and then public consultations. In total, we had 80 individuals from 55 organizations contributing to the product. Next slide. The result of that is a published set of shared variables from which organizations and project managers may adapt relevant and appropriate content for their individual monitoring protocols, reporting systems, databases, and platforms. The framework includes a set of 61 headline, core, and secondary monitoring indicators organized under the 10 UN Decade Principles. We aim to create a flexible structure that allows organizations and restoration practitioners to quickly prioritize the variables that are most relevant to their projects, while providing the detail needed to allow for the potential integration and sharing of information. So very much, again, that trying to promote that interoperability of systems that Julian was just talking about as a focus of the firm. Next slide. There are two components to the framework. First is a report detailing the process that was undertaken and the goals of the framework. Along with the indicators, we've included a set of project descriptors that are not nested under the UN Decade Principles, but rather align with the firm system. A companion to the report is a spreadsheet containing all variable names, descriptions, links to global data standards, links to minimum data reporting recommendations, notes for database managers, and additional information that will support efforts to adopt these indicators into existing systems. We encourage adoption of relevant and appropriate indicators from the framework into individual monitoring protocols, reporting systems, and platforms. And we can provide some guidance and support to interested parties to assist with the adoption of those variables. The framework is detailed and not all parts will be relevant to every system or project. Therefore, we don't expect that any one organization, database, or user would adopt the framework full scale, but rather choose those variables or indicators that are most relevant. The framework fills a gap in the ecosystem restoration monitoring space by organizing bottom up, so detailed project level information, to better align with and contribute to the top down global, country, subnational level monitoring frameworks, such as the firm. It also connects shared monitoring indicators directly to the UN Decade Principles, effectively nesting them in the global context. Ultimately, the framework is intended to reduce duplication of efforts, increase data sharing and aggregation, and contribute to an improved understanding of restoration outcomes and limitations. Last slide. So I'll end here, but for more information or to explore how you can use the indicators as a resource to support your own work, feel free to visit our website or reach out to me directly. I will include the link in the chat. And in fact, I think Lee may have done that already for me. So thank you, Lee. And thanks to you all who have contributed to the development of this framework, and look forward to being in touch with you to integrate this into your own systems.
There we are. Thank you very much, Jillian. I think both the presentation and the update from Julian and also from yourself have really laid the groundwork now for this sort of interoperability between these different systems. And I think it allows us to now monitor on multiple scales, as you mentioned, from the project scale and then aggregating all the way up to the national and the global scale. So it leaves us in, I think, a good position in the next few years to be able to have a really good mid-UN decade monitoring report and update. I'd like to now move us on to the next part of the session today. We're going to move into a panel debate. And we're joined by 3 panelists here in Seoul and a number of panelists online. So I'll just pose this to the crowd, that the panel debate is for you, all of you joining online and in the room. So we're going to have a set of statements or common conceptions or widely held beliefs of the restoration movement, and we're going to put those up on the screen, and we'll use these statements as fodder, and we'll invite each of our panelists to reflect and respond on these statements in an interactive and sort of reflective tone, but also as an entry point for them to showcase the work that they're doing, and how the work that they're doing is actually trying to tackle and address some of these statements. So let's go ahead and put the first statement up on the screen. Oh, so here's the list of our various panelists who are joining us, and I'll introduce them as we turn the floor over to them. So we can go to the next slide. Wonderful. So our first statement is the restoration movement has been hindered by a diverse list of actors tracking pledges against a multitude of indicators, uncertainty around the correct methods to monitor the right ecosystem with an overemphasis on short-term actions, and a long and complex list of restoration planning and monitoring tools on offer. Of course, this is also complemented or further complicated by challenges with tracking additionality and transparency. So to kick us off, I want to invite Dr. Lee Winniwicki, who's the team leader of the soils theme at C4ICRAF, to provide us with the first reflection, joining us very early from Nairobi, and also focusing a bit broadly outside of the forest, but more towards land health. So Lee, terrific that you could join us this morning. Over to you for your reflection to this statement.
Great. Thank you so much, Khalil, and everyone who spoke before me. And I think I have 3 key points I'd like to make, building on what Julian and Jillian were talking about. And one is that it's critical to monitor multiple indicators of ecosystem health. I think we heard both speakers talk about the numerous headline indicators. And the reason this is important is that it will facilitate an understanding of the drivers of degradation as well as the recovery or restoration process. And specifically at C4ICRAF, we found that it's key to combine multiple methods for monitoring. For example, systematic, robust monitoring that takes place on the ground. These data then contribute to building the geo-reference databases that everyone has been talking about. And these field data can then be coupled with remote sensing to produce accurate spatial assessments to enable countries or projects to comply with the monitoring. And finally, we have been now engaging with restoration stewards to capture progress data using citizen science. So this combination of systematic monitoring on the ground, remote sensing, and citizen science has really allowed us to produce accurate assessments of multiple indicators. So Khalil, you already indicated I'm a soil scientist. So this includes indicators of soil health, such as soil organic carbon and soil erosion prevalence, but also the key indicators that we were talking about earlier, and that's tree cover. But I'd like to point out that we're also looking at indicators of tree diversity, as well as grass diversity, because remember, we're talking about rangelands, agricultural landscapes, and forests. So just a final note on that is that this group, this amazing UN Decade Monitoring Task Force, has really come together, as also highlighted by the Global Restoration Observatory, to make sure that we have a comprehensive, transparent list of indicators, but also multiple tools to make sure that we are really tracking the progress of restoration on the ground. Thanks, Khalil.
Yeah, thanks very, very much, Lee, for the update there. You mentioned a couple of things, the importance of using multiple indicators, trying to identify drivers of degradation, geospatial referencing, and specificity. So this all lends towards a robust monitoring system. And I wanted to then just come back to you quickly and ask, why do you think that it's been so hard? We don't see that level of robust monitoring always within projects, although I think the value is sort of inherent. What do you think the major barriers are to having more robust scientific evidence-based monitoring?
I think in the past, we've often had monitoring outside of the co-learning process, and this has really been unfortunate. So monitoring was always seen as top-down, something you do maybe at the very beginning of the project and then possibly at the end for donor reporting. But now the whole paradigm has shifted. And now with this inclusion of stakeholders in the monitoring process, we can actually use these data and the act of monitoring as co-learning. And in the Regreening Africa project, which is aiming to restore 1 million hectares across 8 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, we've actually seen that engaging the farmers, the NGOs, the implementing partners in the monitoring practice, in the monitoring process, we are now seeing that as a scaling technique. So they're so enthused in seeing how their efforts are really having impact on the ground that it's encouraging to actually scale restoration. And this has also led to an adaptive process within the project so that we can shift our implementation activities. So I think the solution is really engaging multiple stakeholders in the monitoring and to see monitoring as truly a co-learning process.
Wonderful, thanks, Lee. I think we'll keep the panel going. I'd like to invite our next speaker, who's Clara Rowe, who's the CEO of the open data digital platform called Restore. And I think it dovetails nicely to Lee's intervention there, which is putting stakeholders at the center of monitoring. Restore is trying to put data and tools into the hands of all of its restoration practitioners worldwide. I think it's currently at 80,000 sites, but I'll stop quoting numbers I'm not familiar with. And I'll invite Clara onto the screen. Thanks for joining us, Clara. Over to you.
Of course. Wonderful to be here. And can you just confirm, is my screen recording up? There we go. Great. So great to be here with you today. Thanks so much. As Khalil said, Restore is an open science platform, and our mission is to support and accelerate the restoration and conservation of nature around the world. We spun off from a research lab, the Crowther Lab at ETH Zurich, just a year ago. Let's pause this for a moment if we can for the recording. I think it got a little advanced. Thank you. And launched a password-protected beta version of our platform on World Environment Day in 2021 in coordination with the launch of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So we removed password protection in October 2021, and anyone in the world now can visit Restore, explore Restore, look at the sites on Restore. We can go back to the recording. Thank you. Today, we're hosting about 100,000 conservation and restoration sites across 110 countries and 14 different biomes. Our approach to monitoring is driven by a simple set of questions. What's most useful to restoration and conservation practitioners around the world, and how can we serve the greatest number of initiatives for the greatest transparency and impact? We started answering that question through consultations with practitioners back in 2020, before we even began to build anything. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the key lessons we learned is that everyone wants something a little bit different. There's no one silver bullet to restoration monitoring, just like there's no silver bullet to any other aspect of restoration or conservation. Projects have distinct goals and distinct needs. And so we've focused on a 3-pronged strategy for monitoring at Restore. Strategy 1 is making a range of existing global monitoring products, that is, products with data available for anywhere on the terrestrial Earth, and make these easy to view. And we've chosen products that show changes across a range of variables in spatial and temporal scales to serve a range of needs and size and start date and duration. You know, I think we're missing a part of the video. Which is all right. I was hoping to show you some of the projects themselves. I can keep going, but I wonder if someone can just give me an indication if there's a way to get us back on track with the screen recording. We should be if we could just take us a few minutes in, and then I can show you a site, a Humbo community assisted natural farmer. regeneration.
Yeah, Claire, I'm not sure if we have the full recording on our side. I wonder if you could describe to us one of the projects. I actually wanted to ask you a follow-up question.
Of course.
It was really fantastic to see some of, I mean, I think that map that you put up was so wonderful to visualize the number of restoration projects that are happening around the world. And I wonder, without the video, if maybe you could just speak to us about some of the stories that Restore is producing now in terms of exchange and knowledge amongst these projects. I know Restore is a monitoring platform, maybe first and foremost, but it's also acting as an opportunity for cross-fertilization amongst these projects. So maybe you could share a little bit on that.
I can, and actually, if my screen is up now, I can play the video myself. And that will allow you to look directly at the project, which I think always helps. So I'm going to pick us back up right here and bring you to a large site in Ethiopia where farmer-managed natural regeneration has literally greened entire landscape. You can see that. And at this scale, you can track progress on Restore looking at changes in net primary productivity, carbon accumulating in plants, even looking at evapotranspiration, how much water is moving into the atmosphere from this landscape, which is really incredible to see. I'll show you a different project in India where a learning center has been planting native tree species. And it's such a small site that the data I showed previously, it can't always detect change. So the high resolution visual imagery that we've included on the platform can. For me, this is incredible to look at the transformation that's happened in this landscape, and you can see that over time. So that's approach number one, right? Make data available and easy to see for everyone. Approach number two is to make field survey data integratable with the Restore platform, and Lee talked about how important this is. But we're starting in 2022 with integration of drone imagery and bioacoustic data. So at the end of the year, sites on Restore are going to be able to upload drone files and get analyses like tree count and evaluation of diversity based on tree crown delineation. And they can upload sound files and get summary information on sound complexity and some of the key species present in their area. And we're particularly interested in data that sheds light on biodiversity of restoration and conservation sites to provide a balance, especially given the proliferation of carbon monitoring tools these days. So we'll continue to build out field survey integration over the years. The last piece of the strategy is to help users sort through the growing list of monitoring tools that are out there today and find those that are most useful. So we're testing some in the field this year. And of course, we're going to pull from the terrific analyses that have already been shared or in development by the restoration community, FAO, GROW, et cetera. And I think it's important here to add a huge caveat about monitoring, which is social indicators. That's around benefits, distribution, community inclusion, land tenure, and these are arguably the most important and complicated things to measure. And I think technology has a very small role to play here. We can simplify the collation of questionnaire data or allow local communities to report directly, but we really have to elevate this issue in terms of the importance of socioeconomic indicators when we're monitoring impact. So, you know, these are the three key strategies. We're really excited to continue to learn and grow with this huge community. And we're committed to continuing to ask ourselves those questions that I mentioned at the beginning. What data is most useful? How can we serve the greatest number of initiatives for the greatest impact? And how can we democratize data and tools to build a more inclusive restoration monitoring ecosystem?
Fantastic, Clara. Thanks so much. I don't think we caught the full breadth of the video, but we did get some of the restoration sites there at the end. So it was great to see. Yeah, thanks. But I think certainly your reflections resonate true. I think there's in the monitoring space, there's always been an overemphasis on the biophysical, and we certainly need more effort, more energy in the socioeconomic side. I think the task force has a socioeconomic sub-task force, which I know has also made some progress. But great to hear the updates from your side. For the final reflection on this first statement, I'd like to turn the screen back to Jillian from GROW for her to provide us a response. Jillian, how do you reflect on this statement, and what is GROW doing to address some of these key challenges?
Thanks, Khalil. To the extent possible, I think we need to drive alignment on guidance, definition systems, and expectations in order to send clear signals to those driving impact on the ground and to enable better apples to apples comparison of projects and outcomes. I mentioned our work around harmonizing project level indicators, but I might note two additional efforts that I think are focused on kind of this effort. So one, and Julian actually referenced this a few minutes ago, we're working with WRI to produce a web-based restoration monitoring tools guide. This will build on research done by the forum in partnership with the monitoring task force and with multiple contributing authors from this panel. The guide will catalog monitoring tools that are currently in use, share case studies of their applied use, and allow for sorting and filtering by different criteria like scale of the project and functional, or I should say like scale of the monitoring that the tool would work on, and the functionality that a user might be looking for in a monitoring tool. So for example, things like baseline setting, data collection, validation, et cetera. So stay tuned for that later this year. And that I think speaks directly to your point around sort of the huge number of tools available. Something else I would note is that we're working with the Accountability Framework Initiative, which is a collaborative of more than a dozen NGOs that have come together to develop agreed definitions and implementation guidance and reporting expectations for corporates specifically, working mainly to meet zero deforestation goals. However, in the coming year, they are considering adding restoration reporting guidance to their common methodology. So we're working with them to define metrics that should be used by companies to track and report impact and outcomes of their restoration efforts in their operations, supply chains, and investments. And while this will apply to the private sector specifically, much of the goal here is to ensure that environmental, human rights organizations, corporate rating and ranking groups, they all have sort of some agreement on what companies need to measure, what data to collect, and how to report. So I'll pause there.
Wonderful. Thanks. Thanks so much, Jillian. Yeah, really exciting to hear about the tool mapping as well. I think for quite some time when engaging stakeholders, there's clear that they're looking for more guidance, not only into what tools are available, but what are the different facets, which ones are actionable, which ones are live, and how they can sort of toggle through that sort of mapped universe of all of the existing tools. And I think it's important to mention, I think that mapping, if I'm not mistaken, was done mostly for terrestrial tools. Is that right?
Yeah, thanks for noting that. That's right, Khalil. Okay. Although we did envision, we're kind of building the website now and thinking about how we might potentially add on in future years. So
wonderful.
See what we can do.
Certainly scope to expand it in the future, but for now, I think the terrestrial tools was enough of a challenge for the first iteration. So thanks very much, Jillian. I think we're going to move on to the next statement, just given the amount of time that we have left. So if we could get that on the screen. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so as they're putting it on the screen, I'll read out the statement. Enthusiasm to engage the private sector is driven by the substantial shortfall in investment in climate and sustainable development agendas, and the private sector's expressed interest in working with landscape actors to green their supply chains, particularly through commitments to emissions reductions and zero deforestation initiatives and restoration. So I think certainly in the restoration space, there's great interest in further engaging the private sector, and certainly still some concerns about transparency and a desire to truly understand the impact of these initiatives. But I think wonderful for us this morning that we have two colleagues, some of who are working to engage the private sector, and then a large private sector actor themselves to provide some insight. So to kick us off with a response or with a reflection on this statement, I'd like to invite Jill Einhorn, who's the head of 1T.org at the World Economic Forum, to share her thoughts on private sector engagement. Jill, thanks so much for joining us. Great to have you on the panel, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Khalil. Wonderful to be here, and thanks very much for all the organization that's gone into this. Indeed, I think if we are looking at the bigger picture of biodiversity collapse, sixth mass extinction, the climate crisis, it's pretty clear that we're not going to get to where we need to go without the private sector. And the challenge here is that the private sector is quite diverse, many different incentives, and not all of them understand the needs when it comes to quality implementation. So that's, working on the ground, Indigenous peoples, local communities, but also from the ecological perspective. And so what we're looking to do at 1T is to say, okay, well, how do we set a framework and an engagement mechanism for the private sector, given that not everyone's where they need to be, to help, on the one hand, to set minimum criteria, and then to help to ratchet up their work to make sure that we're improving as we go. And so some of the minimum criteria, for instance, to avoid greenwashing, is ensuring that every company that gets involved in this agenda has a net zero goal by or before 2050. That just helps make sure that the emissions reductions are happening at the same time as the more sexy conservation and restoration, planting trees, as companies like to focus on, it is happening simultaneously. But also ensuring then that there's transparent sharing of the socially responsible and ecologically responsible approaches, and very importantly, that there's a reporting system that is in place that allows for the self-reporting, and we do that through the IUCN Barometer, and we're just launching, in fact, our very first set of reporting next week with the companies that have committed to us. But then also that it takes it to the next level, and Clara at Restore has shared a little bit more about the Restore's platform. We have a collaboration with Restore, WRI, Tentree, that has an interesting blockchain solution, FAO, Grow, and the UN Decade, all of these discussants on this panel, to help ensure that this isn't just the private sector saying, hey, this is what I'm doing, but there's a way for them to get that real-time transparent monitoring. And so through that process, we're creating a system of competition for good, where a company is able to transparently say, commit to through pledges, this is what I'm doing. But then there's also a reporting mechanism that goes beyond the self-reporting into the domain of geospatial and on-the-ground tools that help to validate that. And I'd just like to come back to the point that Julian made at the beginning of this panel, which is that sound monitoring catalyzes investment. And when it comes to the really credible private sector actors who are wanting to engage in this, in fact, I would say that at the moment there isn't, they're holding back their investments because they're not necessarily seeing the implications and the impact on the ground at scale. And so what we're doing through the monitoring process isn't just the reporting, which often we think about at the end of the value chain, but it's building the case for investment at the beginning. And that really is the way to pull in investments. And so for me, it's really exciting to see the way in which all of these actors are coming together to bring a synergistic system of monitoring into the space, which will allow for greater transparency, not just in the reporting cycle, but also in helping encourage the confidence of companies to invest in the space in the long term.
Thanks so much. Jill, I was wondering, can you share some of the mechanisms that the World Economic Forum and 1T.org use to engage the private sector specifically? And if you could also be a bit cheeky, you could also share some of the challenges that the private sector that you're hearing in terms of why investment is lacking at the moment.
Sure, yes. So when it comes to mechanisms to engage, one very effective way, which isn't sufficient, but it's a good starter, is transparent pledges. So to say, let's make clear through 1T what you're actually doing, and for that to be clearly laid out in a systematic way where companies are comparable. The benefit of that is that when we have a company who comes and says, oh, we'd like to get involved, we can say, well, have a look at the pledges that are already on our system and you work out what you'd like to do based on that. And so in some ways it's a tool to help companies to structure their thoughts and to work out how to invest. I would say in terms of engaging corporates, the other way is to really help to encourage those who are in the industry, who are leaders, to bring others along in the process. And so that's about understanding the various industries, working with the leaders in those industries to identify those companies that could do more, and then helping to create the business case for why this is a good investment. And when it comes to forests, it's just extraordinary to see how that business case unfolds, because it's not just about the forests, it's also about human health, mental health for the pharmaceutical companies. It's about the green transition and helping, on the forestry front, greater conservation rather than just, monocrop plantations, and helping to diversify their work there. When it comes to consumer goods, it's about the future of consumers, so and the priority for nature. So for each industry, there's a different business case, and helping to map that out. What I'll do in the chat afterwards is just share the report that we've done on making the case to invest, because I think that's a good resource for any corporate that's looking to invest and understand what to do there. You asked me to be cheeky, and I just want you to go back to exactly what you wanted me to be cheeky about, so that I can make sure that comment is on point.
Yeah, in engaging the private sector, what are some of those challenges that you're seeing that they're mentioning and bringing up that's limiting investment into the restoration space?
Yeah, I think one challenge is those companies that do greenwashing, because I think there are a lot of really good companies, and Andrew Wilcox is on the call today from Unilever. That's a great example of a company that is really leading the charge and doing a lot of quality work. And the challenge is that gets muddied by those companies that aren't, following those standards. And so the issue that we face in the space often is that we get a lot of journalists who write to us, who want to understand, who take a perspective that corporates shouldn't be involved. And that's really challenging, because if you take a perspective, that perspective, then I think, we've lost before we've started. And so the issue is, how do we help to not just say, nature-based solutions is only for environmentalists, but nature-based solutions needs investment by companies, and those companies need to comply to certain standards, gold standards in the space, to help ensure that they're doing the work that they need to. And so that's a real challenge. I think the other side of it is that corporates are complex creatures. And so there are often good intentions, but not necessarily, the outcomes to those intentions aren't necessarily aligned. And I'm very glad to have heard socioeconomic indicators being raised as one of the big areas for future work, because one of the observations that I have on the corporate side is that I think, companies are getting their heads around how to avoid planting invasive species and how to make sure that they've got good tree diversity, how to start to think about some of the ecological indicators, but on the socio-economic front, it's quite challenging. And that's really the cutting edge for us, which is an area that we're going to be focusing on in the next year, developing a specific report on how to engage Indigenous leaders and local communities to make sure that free, prior and informed consent are implemented within the corporate decision-making structures for the restoration. And that's a very nascent area, which if anyone has suggestions on, would be most welcome.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jill. As you were describing that, I had a picture in my head of Andrew nodding in agreement, or maybe in disagreement, I'm not sure. But we do have, we're very lucky to be joined this morning by Andrew Wilcox, who is the supply chain, who is the sustainable sourcing manager at Unilever. So Andrew, thanks so much for joining. I'd love to hear your reflections either on the statement or also maybe in response to some of Jill's comments.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you, Khalil. Thank you to both Korea, but also our wonderful panelists here. Really amazing people with really good points. So, I think to kick off, I'll obviously focus on Unilever's commitments and then kind of what we're doing about it, but then also an initiative that we're a part of called the Forest Data Partnership. But in addition to our net zero by 2039 commitment, the two that I'll be focusing on today are our deforestation-free supply chain by 2023 for 5 key crops, being palm oil, soybeans, tea, cocoa, and paper and board. And beyond this, a commitment to protect and restore 1.5 million hectares by 2030. And so we've heard this point a few times before, but in order to do this sort of work at the scale of the supply chain, and especially with the credibility and rigor to avoid greenwash, we need much greater transparency in the supply chain. And so we're working there with technology companies, Google, SAP, and others, to build the tech we need for enhanced supply chain transparency. But there's so much more than that. One of the things that I'll be focusing on is that, there has been huge progress in satellite and geospatial data and creating global data sets on forests. But largely they're utilized in a fairly fragmented way. And this leads to different versions of what's happening on the ground. And this leads to kind of a lack of consistent and transparent methods to validate data and intercompare models, which then becomes a persistent barrier to the systematic monitoring. And so this issue around systematic, transparent monitoring is the reason why we're so proud as Unilever to be part of the Forest Data Partnership. It's an initiative developed with the U.S. Agency for International Development, FAO, World Resources Institute, NASA Severe, and Google Cloud. And we're coming together to engage stakeholders, to align on the key gaps in data, and to address these gaps with focused innovation. And so we want this to help enable the exchange of knowledge, but really the shared understanding of forests needed to drive systemic change. So ending deforestation and accelerating restoration. And so Unilever is the private sector lead in the Forest Data Partnership in launching this data ecosystem. And we invite our peers in the industry to join us. The ambition of the Forest Data Partnership is to operationalize principles of inclusive data science and explainable machine learning in driving convergence towards a shared understanding of forests that can be transparently validated. And so our core belief here, specific to the supply chain, is that when manufacturers, traders, processors, all the players along the value chain, but most importantly, farming and producing communities have a shared understanding of forests, collective action can be more effectively realized. And so for us, collective action is a fairly simple concept. It means meeting our commitments and zero deforestation. So that's kind of the summary here. And my call here is just to stay tuned. The Forest Data Partnership will be launching shortly with details on how to engage.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I know that Unilever is one of the the private sector pioneer partner in the Forest Data Partnership, and you mentioned that FAO is also a core partner. I wanted to quickly turn the floor to Remy D'Annunzio, who's also an FAO forestry officer working with the Forest Data Partnership. So Remy, how do you see the connection then between the restoration actions scheduled to take place in the Forest Data Partnership and the firm?
Thanks, Khalil. So yeah, the Forest Data Partnership has basically two main components, and Andrew has touched based on the greening supply chains, but the other one is really on restoration. And as much as we need baseline information that is streamlined and accessible and harmonized for the practitioners to compare results against for supply chains, we have the same equivalence on restoration activities. So it's been mentioned that we need better data, not only on biophysical, but also on socioeconomic aspects. We need those baselines to measure progress against, and that's what the partnership will be aiming at developing. What the component that potentially was missing until then was the framework into which integrating those baselines and data. And the firm will probably be a really good place to test those baselines, to share the geospatial data produced by the partnership associated with those restoration activities. So I can see definitely a very good timing between the launch of the firm registry today, for instance, and the upgrades in the firm geospatial platform, because we're going to be producing data. We're going to be making processes and algorithms available to produce data that will be standardized and harmonized, but we're really in a place where it can be shared and it can be accessed. And definitely the firm is going to be providing this framework. So yeah, there's very good timing between both. Right from the start, we're going to have the standardized framework to put those data into, and yeah, I think that's the container that was previously missing is now there, and it's good that it's there from the beginning. Juden mentioned the UNDecade flagships and the restoration activities. The ones that will be developed in the different geographies that the partnership will tackle are also one of those, and they will be one of the, hopefully, the first data sets to be put in. Yeah, and so definitely the Forest Data Partnership will benefit from the firm, and hopefully the processes and algorithms that are being developed that Andrew mentioned could also be integrated into the baseline activities and data sets to measure progress against.
Wonderful, thanks, Remy. So we're running about 10 minutes behind schedule, and so I'm going to skip a few of the questions just to ensure that we do have some time at the end for the audience online and also those who have joined us in person. So I'll ask the technical colleagues if we can put the third statement up, and I think we can round out the panel debate with the final statement. Wonderful. Okay, so the final statement is governments and businesses are not living up to the voluntary commitments to have tropical forest loss and to restore the close to 1 billion hectares. Commitments need to be measurable, geographically specific, and transparent to create realistic targets and to help monitor progress. So to kick off the reflections to this statement, I want to invite Patrick Mugi from FAO Kenya. Patrick, really glad that you could be here with us this morning and in person. I'd love to hear some of your reflections on this statement.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, participants, and thank you for taking your time to be here. My name is Patrick. I work with FAO Kenya, implementing a project under the Restoration Initiative. Yes, I will agree that indeed we are not achieving or realizing the commitments that we are setting as governments, as businesses. We are not short or limited in terms of players who are in the FLR sector, the forest and landscape restoration. We have many tools, as you've heard from the previous speakers. There's a lot of expertise, there's a lot of research that has undergone, and we are not short of any of this. But we have to ask ourselves, why aren't we achieving these targets that we are setting? Why aren't these commitments being achieved? For instance, in Kenya, we have, the government has committed to restore 5.1 million hectares. That is under the Bond Challenge and the AFR 100. It's also a constitutional requirement that we have 10% recover. To date, we've already surpassed actually that target. We are around 12% and 8% forest cover. But in terms of data collection, there is one thing that we must always remember, that there is a concept called GIGO, which means garbage in, garbage out. So irrespective of the techniques and the tools that we may develop as an international community, as governments, the major thing that we must look at is where is the source of this data? Where is the data coming from? So what I will say, Khalid, to answer your question, is that there are two things. out of having all these aspects, what we are lacking is actually the aspect of coordination. We need to streamline how data is collected, how it is reported. So all these, from where I sit, I can say that we are lacking that coordination. In Kenya, what we are trying to do is we have a Forest and Landscape Restoration Action Plan and a Monitoring Technical Working Group that is leading these efforts. Number two is why I think we are not achieving this is that we are concentrating so much on the quantitative aspects and forgetting the qualitative. What am I trying to say? These actions are done on the ground. These actions are done by people, okay? So they are the way communities perform their day-to-day activities. We tend to forget that aspect. For example, in Kenya, where we work in, 80% the people are pastoralists. So these people do not understand why they need to plant trees. What they understand is that the more cattle that I have, the more wealthier, the more well-off I am. They do not put into perspective the carrying capacity of their land. They don't put into perspective the carrying capacity of their land. So what I will say is that we need to look more on the socioeconomic indicators. For all development, it is three-pronged. Number one, you have to look at, as we are looking at the planet. Number two, we have to look at the people. And number three, we have to look at what do they get from that ecosystem. That is a profit. If people are not getting something from their work, they will never take it seriously, okay? So to me, those are the elements that I think we are missing, and that is why these commitments, maybe to date, we have not been able to achieve them. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Patrick. I know also in a few weeks' time, there's a technical working group meeting in Kenya focused on the tools and technology. So I'm excited to dig into that a little bit further later on. Given the time, I think we'll just turn over to Adriana. Adriana is the chief of the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration, the GPFLR, and a senior forest policy officer at IUCN. So Adriana, we know you also had some difficulties in your flight to get here, but we're thrilled you made it in time for our event. So over to you for your reflections.
Thank you, Khalil. Patrick has expressed very, very good key points on the first part of the statement, so let me focus on the second part of this discussion, which is that commitments need to be measurable, as well as many other key criteria. And you have heard from previous presenters and initiatives about the restoration barometer. I want to share with you a little bit more of information about what is this. So the Bond Challenge, you might have heard of it, is a global goal to bring under restoration 350 million hectares by 2030. Restoration pledges come from countries and non-governmental organizations as well. The Restoration Barometer was created back in 2016, before the Decade on Restoration, to track the Bond Challenge pledges, but a lot of things have happened since then. Now the Restoration Barometer is designed for countries and private companies that have committed to restore landscapes to report on their progress, whether it is international commitments under the Rio Conventions, under the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, or 1T.org. One key thing is that we are taking as baseline year 2010, just because the Bond Challenge was launched the year after. More than 40 countries endorse the application of the barometer. The barometer is not a pilot or an idea, it's something that has been used for some years now. And it offers exactly this, a very streamlined set of indicators. So it's not, what it's trying to do is basically try to paint a picture of progress, both on action and impact. As you know, restoration is not just something that happens in a split second. It's a very complex process. It involves policy, institutional arrangements, deployment of finance, generation of monitoring systems in country and other technical planning aspects. So the barometer aims to monitor these elements as well as the impacts on the ground, more connected to climate change mitigation, biodiversity, jobs creation, by the way, and we are offering the possibility of disaggregating job creation by gender, as well as the star of all progress, which is hectares under restoration. This involves both direct hectares under restoration as well as the hectares that are, which ecosystem functionality is improved through restoration in the surrounding areas. So a quick note about the implementation. We do have numbers of restoration going on the ground. Perhaps they are not the numbers that we should have at this moment, and this is not necessarily because there is an under-implementation, but we believe it's a matter of really doubling up efforts to apply these restoration tools, such as the restoration barometer, in more and more countries. So far, the barometer has been applied in 13 countries, and implementation has slowed down a lot because of COVID, sorry. But in this year, we're aiming to implement the barometer in 22 countries. And also in this year, we are partnering, as the previous speaker, Jill mentioned, with 1T.org to apply the restoration barometer with a multiplicity of private sector, a cohort of private sector, the early movers, such as Google, Unilever, Salesforce, and many other companies. One last thing that we mentioned, we heard before, is the challenges on regarding how to track restoration. Restoration is not a different story around the world. It changes depending on the reality and context of the country, and the restoration barometer aims to capture these differences through the restoration intervention typology that represents many ecosystems as well as many interventions responding to best practices. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Adriana. Let me extend a big thanks to Adriana and all to the remaining panelists as well for your reflections, your contributions, and your interventions in this segment. But please don't go away just yet. We will open the floor shortly for questions. Just reflecting on some of the language that's been shared during the debate, I think we've seen such an improvement on the tech side, access to technology and platforms, the multitude of tools that are available. But I think what's clear is there is no perfect monitoring system. Each of the systems will have a utility given the context on the ground. And I think the data doesn't have to be perfect either. It's more about progress, not perfection. And I think we have enough data, and we have a multitude of monitoring systems that can give us now a much clearer picture on what's happening on the ground, scaled all the way up to the global level. And then the importance as well of the private sector. I think that's something else that monitoring can really enable investments into investment landscapes for the private sector. We're going to continue to see increasing public-private producer partnerships, which I think are extremely valuable. We're going to see hopefully the greening of supply chains, and monitoring really is that key lever that we need to try to utilize to see that scale out. So a big thanks. I think we're going to move to the final part of our segment today, and I'd like to invite up, we'll start with Dennis Garrity. So I won't invite him up because he's already on the screen, hopefully. I'd like to introduce Dr. Dennis Garrity, who's the Drylands Ambassador for the UN Convention on Desertification, Chairman of the Evergreening Alliance, and former DG of World Agroforestry. Dennis is going to present his paper on the case for natural regeneration approaches in global restoration efforts.
Well, thank you, Khalil, and good day, everybody. This is the forestry profession's great moment in history. Tony Ronaldo and I would like to make the case to you today that natural regeneration must now emerge from being too often an afterthought in forest restoration to being the go-to method if we as a global community are going to get serious about achieving the massive scale of forest restoration that is so needed and talked about today. We will first lay out the incredibly ambitious scale of restoration that is absolutely necessary to remove vast quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in order to help stabilize the climate. Then we'll clarify the types of natural regeneration that can and are contributing to that aspiration. And finally, we're going to propose that the monitoring systems that are now being deployed to assess progress in restoration commit themselves to differentiating and quantifying forest restoration processes on the basis of just what type of restoration methods are being deployed on the ground everywhere. Okay, let's get started. First slide, please. Carbon dioxide removals are now well recognized as fundamental to stabilizing the Earth's climate alongside emissions reduction. The scale of removals needed are staggering, even if humanity is successful in attaining net zero emissions. You see the pool of necessary removals in the blue zone at the bottom of this graph below the line. This is what is necessary to hopefully avoid a climate disaster of cascading Earth system tipping points. So we need to do more than simply engage in restoration. We need, we believe, to spearhead a big, audacious drawdown goal, a global goal that is quantitative, that the community can move around, to inspire, to drive restoration actions at all levels, from the global to the national to the individual community. Unfortunately for removals, we don't yet have such a goal. Now, next slide. I chair the board of the Global Evergreening Alliance, and I've been deeply engaged in developing it over the past decade. The Alliance's mission is to achieve massive impact in land restoration globally, and we now have over 70 member organizations, including virtually all of the biggest development and conservation NGOs in the world, as well as many regional, national, and local organizations, and a number of key research organizations that provide technical support. Next slide. The published evidence shows clearly the enormous potential for nature-based solutions to be the cornerstone of the carbon drawdown effort. So we added up the streams of realistic possibilities, and we established the goal of capturing an additional 20 billion tons of CO2 every year by mid-century, but while improving livelihoods, particularly the livelihoods of the poorest and most vulnerable populations, and caring much better for the land than we have ever done in the past. Now, that 20 billion ton goal is the basis for the Evergreening the Earth Green Up to Cool Down campaign, which was launched at the United Nations 2 years ago. Next slide. The campaign's global goal is made up of a number of target areas for capturing and storing more carbon in the world's landscapes. We've laid out unique strategies for the ecosystems of degraded forest lands, degraded farmlands, and degraded pasture lands. For example, the Evergreening the Earth campaign has pledged to restore tree cover on 575 million hectares of degraded forest lands during the next 30 years, and thereby capture an additional 8.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year from the atmosphere. And this is only about 1/3 of the treeless degraded forest land in the world, which is now about 1.7 billion hectares. Much of this land can be restored by natural regeneration or by deploying assisted natural regeneration, a low-cost alternative to planting trees. Next slide. Now, there are two basic types of natural regeneration: unassisted natural regeneration and assisted natural regeneration. Unassisted natural regeneration is currently happening on hundreds of millions of hectares of land that has been abandoned from other uses, particularly unproductive farming. This is occurring on vast areas in Europe, North America, the Amazon, and other parts of the world as well. It is also occurring on protected areas where protection is improving, and particularly in newly protected areas that are being established. Then there are three basic types of assisted natural regeneration: community-based natural regeneration in community forests, state-sponsored assisted natural regeneration, such as has been done on a vast scale in China, and farmer-managed natural regeneration, which is revitalizing farmlands on tens of millions of hectares, particularly in the dry lands of Africa. Next slide. The encouraging news is that over the past 20 years, an area of forest the size of France has been regenerated around the world. This is nearly 60 million hectares of restored forest land. And from the global point of view, it is an enormous starting point for this process. Now, we need to examine how we go from here. And we're only restoring a tiny fraction of the tree planting that is important, but natural regeneration process is already significant and it must be vastly accelerated. Next slide. One of the big questions is whether to scale up natural regeneration or to stimulate more tree planting. Both are important, but we know that natural regeneration is much cheaper than tree planting, and it brings with it much greater advantages in biodiversity conservation. And it enhances many other environmental and productive services for people and the land. Accelerated rewilding of the earth would be a tremendous positive tipping point affecting the earth climate system. And ultimately, however, tree planting and forest plantations will never be able to restore the scale of forest cover that is required. It is much more expensive, requires much more expertise, and is much more at risk of failure. Next slide. Ethiopia is an example of community-based natural regeneration. This country has committed itself.
Dennis, I'm so sorry. I'm just going to have to jump in really quickly. I know you've got a few more slides left. If I can give you one more minute, we need to wrap up so that we have enough time for our second poster presenter. Thanks so much.
Very good, very good. And the people of Ethiopia are restoring their land in these watershed enclosures all around the country. Next slide. Likewise, similarly, assisted natural regeneration has enabled communities in many other countries to have restoration success, such as in Bohol in the Philippines, next slide, in Niger, and next slide, across the entire Sahel, where we now have documented 21 million hectares of farmer-managed natural regeneration. Next slide. Our proposal is to this amazing group of forest restoration monitoring professionals assembled here today to begin working harder to distinguish the tree cover changes that you are quantifying on the ground by forest restoration types. This information will be of enormous importance in clarifying the nature of restoration efforts that you are making, and it will show what type of forest restoration is already occurring, meeting humanity's needs for the massive drawdown that is so necessary during the coming decades. In conclusion, let's remember that our house is on fire. The entire world has got to mobilize on a war footing to reduce emissions and to evergreen the earth and provide a crucial means to draw down carbon and reverse the momentum of global heating. You may consult, next slide, you may consult the links on this slide for more information, and I would be happy to discuss your interests in getting involved with the Evergreening the Earth campaign. Onwards with urgency, and thank you for listening. Now back to you, Khalil.
Thank you very much, Dennis. A strong call to action and a reminder of the urgency of the challenges at hand. Thank you. I'd like to now, for the final presentation, invite Mr. Ki-Hyung Park, a research official from the National Institute of Forest Sciences, to present his paper on the case studies for Korea-China's Combating Desertification Cooperation Project in China. I believe Mr. Park will be presenting in Korean, so there is translation if you have your headsets. And I'll ask if you just take 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
예, 안녕하십니까. 저는
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Ki-hyung Park, or Park Ki-hyung, from the National Institute of Forest Science. Thank you very much for this opportunity to give a presentation. As was introduced, I would like to introduce you some case studies on Korea and China's combating desertification cooperation project in China. And I would like to share with you mostly images and pictures. In 2000, we've been struggling with the yellow sand, and that's why a lot of afforestation efforts were underway in China and Mongolia. In 2001 to 2005, what we did was decide to cooperate in afforestation in 5 provinces in the western part of China. You can see that these are the areas, the total of 5 sites. It's a total of 8,040 hectares. And in 10 years' time after this project, at the Korea-China Forest Cooperation Committee, the 2 countries proposed a combating desertification research project. And the 2 countries decided to engage in joint monitoring and assessment on the afforestation project of 2001 to 2005, and we signed this research agreement to understand the impact. It includes ecological vegetation, changes in the land use around the forests, and the socio-economic impacts of each region. So let me now move on to sharing with you some pictures. This is the city, Bayan City in Gansu Province. This is the early stage of plantation. And in 2017, when we conducted a field survey, we were able to see that the Robinia was the key tree species that we were able to see. And you can see that the survival rate was close to 94%. If I did have more time, I wanted to give you some more specifics. But what I can say is that even now, here, what was happening, I would like to mention that in restoration, it's true that we were quite successful, but we still have to continue on to water the area, and I wasn't exactly sure whether this is what we really wanted to achieve in the first place. And next, we see here Ningxia Province, the Pinglu County, survival rate of 53%, the key tree species being the salix.
넘어가지 않나요? 다음 부탁드립니다.
The next slide, please. Cannot progress my slides. Could you please switch to the next slide?
다음 페이지 부탁드립니다.
And next is in Inner Mongolia, Kajungdonchi. In 2000, you can see that we've only had sand dunes, and with the afforestation joint project, we flattened out the sand dunes, and then we planted the popular trees. And in 2017, this is what it looks like. You can see that we have these lush forests in Inner Mongolia. And then moving on, in 2017, when we engaged in the field survey, survival rate was 82%. Next slide, please. And the next case is in Guizhou Province, Suiwon County. You can see that this from 2005 to 2018, you can see the progress. So this is the very same region. This was a karst scrubland type of region, but you can see that we've been able to rapidly restore this area. Next slide, please. You can see that in the Eukomia, Robinia, and Cupressus, we've been able to see these tree species, and the survival rate of all of these 3 species were 90 to 95+%. And we've also visited the Turfan of Xinjiang Province. At that time, foreigners were not able to enter this region, so only the Chinese field experts were involved, so we could not engage in a detailed survey. However, you can see that the Haxeolian, the tree species, was surveyed, and you can see that these were some of the results on the growth. As we were engaging in this field investigation, there were some lessons learned. And as all of the other panelists have mentioned, when you think about restoration, we need long-term monitoring and assessment. And the second point is that it's important to have specific and detailed information when we want to really bring about impact. So if there are any successful cases or any failure cases, we need to understand the reason behind the success and the reason behind the failure. And in order to understand that, we have to engage in a field investigation. But I know that it's the same case for Korea as well as other international organizations, where we're too much focused on only the successful stories or the successful cases. And we're just trying to find any successes here in the story. But I think that there's much more to learn from the cases that we failed. And even when we apply the same restoration techniques, for instance, some areas we may be seeing a higher survival rate than the others. So can we say that this was a success or a failure? So I think that it shouldn't be a binary type of approach. So that's why I wanted to mention that it's about learning from all cases, whether it was successful or not. And the panelists have mentioned about the importance of database. And on the field, with the Chinese, what I recognized was that there was field data internally, but it was true that it was very difficult to get other or acquire or access other techniques, platforms externally. So yes, we do have many platforms and techniques, but it's really important to have technology that can be accessible to those on the field. So that is all for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Park. A big thanks to both of our poster presenters. I know how challenging it can be to summarize, a lifetime or a field season, even work into 5 minutes. So thank you very much for your efforts there. It looks like we're very quickly running out of time. We may have an opportunity for one question, one very short, concise question, if there is one. I saw your hand raised first, and there's a microphone right beside you. So if you could please also say your name and then which panelist you're directing the question to. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Cami, and my question is to Jill. I think that's her name. Resto, the lady who spoke about from Resto. Having been engaged for a long time in land rehabilitation, I find that unless farmers value in terms of income their livelihoods from any restoration in a mosaic landscape, I believe, no amount of biophysical monitoring will sustain the success of a restoration operation. So what does Resto have in their program to monitor income, values, all of those things?
Jill, if you're still with us and able, if you could respond.
I'll jump in. I think the question's for me.
I'm Clara. Clara, right.
No worries, and thank you so much for the question. I think it's key. And as I mentioned, I think technology actually has only a very small role to play in collecting socioeconomic indicators, as you described. And so we're looking to partner very closely with projects on the ground who are collecting that information and look for frameworks to be able to bring that into our platform. So we want to highlight it. We want to elevate it, and we can link if there are specific tools that are technological to collect that data, we can link that into our platform, but we see our role here as elevating the role of socioeconomic indicators. We can't monitor it in a geospatial fashion.
Thanks so much, Clara. I can see that the colleagues in the room are getting ready to prep for the next session. So let me just start by saying a huge thank you to the participants in the room, the participants online for engaging in the dialogue today. If you could join me actually in giving a big thanks also to our panel. We can join them and give them a round of applause. Thank you for your time, for your interventions. I think it was a wonderful and really packed schedule. But thank you for bearing with us. I think I learned a lot this morning. So I hope you enjoy the remainder of the World Forestry Congress. Stay safe, and thank you very much for coming today.